Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series. This is not a series on postmodernism. In this video we're going to be looking at what is postmodern political philosophy. As a hint, it's not Marx, despite him showing up in this video. So, following the tragedies of World War II, the world of political philosophy was grappling with how people could come to accept metanarratives that led to atrocities. Whether that was the metanarrative of Nazism, allowing for the Holocaust, the metanarrative of communism, allowing for Stalin's atrocities, or the metanarrative of scientific progress being good, leading to the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Postmodernism challenges these modernist claims and attempts to explain how, given the same evidence, one person might accept communism, another Nazism, and another capitalism. In this video, we're going to be very focused on postmodern political philosophy as it applies to these kind of broad meta-narratives within political philosophy. There are implications for politics that come from other parts of postmodernism, like postmodernism about truth, rationality, or reason, but we're not going to cover those here. We'll cover those in the videos coming up. In this one, we're really going to focus solely on postmodernism about these political meta-narratives. So, before delving into postmodern critiques of political philosophy, it's worthwhile to note what it is not. Postmodern political philosophy is not Marxist or socialist, nor is it capitalist, feminist, liberal, conservative, supportive of identity politics, or critical race theory. All of these are modernist meta-narratives. There are many on both the left and right that want to construct a postmodern straw man that either embraces Trumpian post-truth demagoguery or socialist anti-reason cancel culture. Both are inaccurate. Since the postmodernist does not endorse any individual meta-narrative, rather they attempt to explain why different views have come to exist by doubting all these meta-narratives themselves. As noted in the initial video, political postmodernists are not committed to other versions of postmodernism, scientific, philosophical, etc. Political postmodernists are not necessarily anti-truth or anti-reason. They are anti-meta-narrative. So, with that out of the way, let's take a look. First, it may be worthwhile to revisit the definition of a meta-narrative in the political context. A meta-narrative in this context is an overarching explanation of why things are the way they are, that tells a cohesive story, weaving together individual experiences and instances into an explanation of why certain things take place. Meta-narratives often take the same data, but draw different conclusions and predictions using them. Postmodernists are skeptical of these meta-narratives, since they allow individuals to draw different conclusions from the exact same data or information, and they're not comparable across those different meta-narratives, since they use the same data. Once again, similar to different language games or different paradigms, these meta-narratives about politics can't be compared and yet draw different conclusions given the same information. So, in order to understand this, imagine a graph of various data points. So, data points can be thought of as kind of the agreed upon facts of a given situation. While some theories may dispute individual data points, that's not the majority of the disagreement. The disagreement comes in what fills in between those data points, how those data points can be used to predict the future, how those data points can explain what's going on in the spaces that we haven't measured, in the things that we can't see. So, that's your theory. That's what connects those data points and predicts things into the future. The theory is the meta-narrative that connects the data points, the connection that predicts what will happen in cases where we have no data, or explains things that we haven't observed or haven't seen yet. Different meta-narratives explain data points in different ways. They use different stories to connect, and therefore disagree as to why the data points are what they are, and what new data points would add to the system. So a theory like this perfectly encapsulates those three data points as well, but makes completely different predictions, as the last theory we saw. Adding more data points may eliminate some lines, but there are always going to be an infinite number of possible explanations of any given data set. For any data set, there are an infinite number of lines that describe it. Check out our series on the problem of underdetermination for how this impacts scientific theory. But in this, we're going to look at how it impacts politics and political meta-narratives. So, for example, about political postmodernism, take the following three data points. So we have a piece of information: economic inequality worldwide is greater than it's ever been. The share of people in absolute poverty is lower than it's ever been. And partisanship is very high in developed countries. So we have these 3 data points, and different meta-narratives are going to try to explain why those are the case and use them to predict the future and therefore give reasons for adopting certain policies. So different meta-narratives are going to explain these individual facts differently. So let's take a look. Marxism, for example, might explain that the reason that inequality is high is the only way for the world to become more equal is for the proletariat to rise up and take the means of production from the bourgeoisie. That hasn't happened yet, and so inequality is increasing. The reason that the share of people in poverty is lower than it's ever been is because we have had incremental expansions in social safety nets and public investment in people that have masked the fact that poverty can only be eliminated through the workers coming together and overthrowing the bourgeoisie. These incremental expansions have kept people from engaging in a glorious revolution, what have you. And the reason partisanship is high is because private sector capture of government institutions and corruption and rising inequality has led to dissatisfaction with existing political structures and eventually will demand revolution. So this is the Marxist framing of these data points. For example, there may be other Marxist framings. This is just an example to kind of show how someone might draw a theory to connect these data points. But that's not the only theory you could have out there. Capitalism tells a different story. For example, capitalism might say that inequality is a necessary consequence of economic development, but that economic growth is good for everyone, and gains for the wealthy eventually trickle down to the poor. And so while you're always going to have inequality if you're developing, that growth is inevitably going to lead to poverty reduction. And as the economy becomes more diverse, individuals will support specific policies that support the industries they work on more than towards the common good. And therefore you have high partisanship, not because of state capture, but because individuals in a certain industry will support policies that support that industry, whereas individuals in a different industry may support a different policy. Neither of those policies may be the best for the public good. Evangelical Christianity might tell a different story. They might say that the righteous followers of God are being rewarded with wealth and sinners are being punished. That's why we have inequality. That God is making the world a better place by working through good charitable Christians to reduce poverty. And that atheism and liberalism have tempted people away from the true path of God, and therefore partisanship is very high. Once again, explains the data points, but does it in a completely different way, using a completely different meta-narrative. And finally, of course, conspiracy theory can still connect these same data points, but do it in a completely different way. They might say that lizard people and Satanists have taken over the government, and businesses are consolidating wealth and power. That's why we see economic inequality. We see people in poverty going lower is because some real people have realized that the lizard people and Satanists have taken over and have started to fight back. And partisanship is really high because the real people are fighting against the lizard people and the Satanists for control. Once again, explains the data points, but does so in a very roundabout and very different from the other meta-narratives way. Now, for the postmodernists, they realize this. They see that these meta-narratives all explain the data that we see and do it in different ways, and so there's no way to tell which one is right. Socialism might be right about some things, but capitalism might be right about others. There's not one overarching meta-narrative that perfectly explains all of the data that we have. The postmodernist is critical of any meta-narrative that attempts to explain the wide diversity of human experience in one concise package. So, now political postmodernists are not stating that they have a better meta-narrative to explain what we see, nor are they advocating for giving up on reason or truth. Saying that all postmodernists don't do that, but political postmodernists aren't necessarily saying that. Rather, they're just critical of any theory that attempts to offer one holistic, complete meta-narrative to explain the features of society, predict policies, and make those connections. Because they claim that there are an infinite number of other such theories that explain the same data points in a different way. So, postmodernism about political philosophy is not neo-Marxism, post-truth denialism, or any other meta-narrative. Those are meta-narratives, but Postmodernism is the skepticism towards all of those meta-narratives. It is inherently suspicious towards these broad, modernist narratives about the right way to govern people and about the explanations for particular phenomena. Just as postmodern artists doubted that there was one right way to do art, postmodernists about politics doubt that there is one right way to do government. Rather, that they think that there are drawbacks and benefits to individual systems, and none of them are perfectly capture reality. Or we can't tell which could perfectly capture reality because they're incommensurable to a certain degree. Postmodernists don't want it to be the case that politics lacks a single simple explanation. They're simply describing why such a heterogeneity of views exists, even when individuals agree on the facts. Now, one of the reasons postmodernism is often used kind of as this boogeyman is because individuals on the left or the right use it to break down their opponent's theories, but then completely set it aside and ignore it when applied to their own theories. True postmodernism about politics is denying all of those meta-narratives. So don't be fooled by someone that is fighting against postmodernism on one side or using the arguments of postmodernism to apply to one side, but not to the other. Now, before leaving political postmodernism, it's important to understand why the straw men of comparing it to Marxism, feminism, or Trumpism are so pervasive, despite these clearly being driven by deeply modernist narratives. The interplays between feminism and postmodernism are complex, and a later video in the series will cover them in full. That said, the philosophical feminist position that genders should be equal but are not yet is a deeply modernist notion in the sense that it is a meta-narrative explaining why certain features of the world are the way that they are. And particularly of the patriarchy, the oppression of women, all of these things are part of that meta-narrative. So in that way, it's certainly not postmodern because it's accepting a specific meta-narrative. But we'll look at the interplays between postmodernism and feminism in a future video because they're a little bit more complicated than is often spoken about. So, first off, let's look at socialism. So, socialism is often confused with postmodernism due to a critique in many socialist works of quote-unquote modernity and the modern condition which arose from the Industrial Revolution and increasing inequality, capitalism, all these things, and increasing economic growth. While these thinkers are certainly objecting to a specific modernist narrative, namely capitalism, that does not mean that they are expressing a postmodernist response. Yes, they are critical or skeptical of a particular meta-narrative, but they are not critical of all possible meta-narratives. Rather, they're trying to replace one modernist narrative with another modernist narrative. Some even argue that Trumpism is essentially postmodern as it discards truth, rationality for performativity, and that Trump's persona as a working class hero, or the idea of taking America back to a perceived golden age where minorities and women were oppressed, is a simulacrum, a representation of a representation which connects not to reality, but to the idea of what people want. Trump being a working class person is not something that connects to the reality of his existence, but rather connects to an idea of what people might want out of a president, of someone that is like them. The idea of going back to a perceived American golden age where everything was better doesn't actually match on to the reality of how things were 50 or 100 years ago when people's life expectancies were shorter, etc., but rather to an idealized version, this simulacrum, this representation of a representation that's no longer connected to reality, this hyper-real thing. So it's the case for why someone might think Trumpism is something that's very postmodern. However, many campaigns, though Trump's in particular, fit with these ideas. They accept contradictions, they bend the truth, they conjure idealized images of society, whether that's in the past or the future, and the images portrayed of candidates are often disconnected from reality and more closely connected to what people would theoretically want out of a candidate. But that doesn't make them actively postmodernist. Rather, they are a demonstration that postmodernism is an accurate description of the world. For example, people can draw drastically different conclusions from the same information based on their own meta-narrative. The fact that so many people can accept a different meta-narrative that leads to individuals viewing the same events differently is a demonstration of the postmodernist position. That there's not one objectively clear and obvious correct meta-narrative, but rather you are interpreting the events that you see through your lens and through your particular meta-narrative. But it's not an exemplification of it. That doesn't make Trump or any campaign be something that is itself postmodern. Rather, it is an exemplification of the postmodern fact that people can interpret the same facts differently based on the presiding meta-narrative, language game, paradigm, what have you, that they accept. However, Trump is arguably quite modernist in the political sense. He paints a clear modernist narrative that elite liberals have enriched themselves through globalization and diversification at the expense of white working-class men. He may use the fact that postmodernism is true to challenge important elements of meta-narratives, such as the claim that the media is a reliable source of information, but he doesn't simply leave you faced with skepticism. Rather, he replaces that with a different meta-narrative, that he's the only reliable source of information. He doesn't discard all meta-narratives entirely. Like Marx, he's not asking you to doubt all meta-narratives, just doubt certain meta-narratives. Things like the media is reliable, globalization is good for everyone, US elections are free and fair, and replace them with new meta-narratives. Trump is the only reliable source of information, globalization is bad, the election was stolen, etc. He's not saying doubt all meta-narratives, and so he's not postmodern in that sense. But rather, he's saying get rid of these meta-narratives and replace them with these other ones. Now, a position that's often closely associated with postmodernism is poststructuralism. We're not going to talk about it in depth here. We are going to mention it briefly because of some of the linkages. In a future video, we will cover it in full. In the context of political philosophy, this is often associated with theories that question the implicit valorization of certain sets of pairs of opposites, which are used to interpret text. So when you're reading a text, in order to interpret and understand it, you need background knowledge and information and assumptions you're making about the valorizations of certain things, that error is bad and truth is good, implicit assumptions like wealth being better than poverty, male being better than female, white being better than black, etc. Those implicit assumptions need to be there for you to understand what someone means when they are writing a particular text, because the text alone is insufficient to understand that. According to the post-structuralists, these assumptions and valorizations are not objectively justified, but rather the product of a culture in power exerting its will, or exerting something that will keep it in power. Political postmodernism endorses the questioning of these implicit valorizations as a meta-narrative itself, but would look suspiciously on the claim that all valorizations are necessarily a product of power dynamics, or that all valorizations are inherently bad or inaccurate or unjustified, because that, once again, in and of itself sounds like a meta-narrative. And so there's a certain level of backing up and questioning. Though, as we'll cover in our last video in this series, there's an important line between kind of more academic skeptic postmodernists and Pyrrhonian skeptics that are simply doubting everything. But for more on this, check out our video on the second half, really, of our video on what is racism, and the next video in this series on postmodernism about language for more on post-structuralists a little bit and some of the things that they're doing. Now, while this idea of kind of pluralism is central to all aspects of postmodernism, there are other aspects which can be found to various degrees in individual disciplines. So we're going to look at our lovely modernism, postmodernism chart here to understand these. So we have on the modernist side, you have objective facts. There's one theory that's right, that's socialism, capitalism, democracy, etc., that there's a right way to govern people. For postmodernists, those are subjective claims. No one meta-narrative perfectly explains the facts, perfectly explains the right way to govern, and perfectly predicts people's behavior. For modernists, there's a faith in meta-narratives. There's one right meta-narrative about power that can explain everything. For the postmodernists, there's a skepticism of those meta-narratives. They fail to explain political power and the right way to govern. For the modernists, there's a simple story. One meta-narrative can explain everything and teach you the right way to run government. There's one line running through those dots that is right, and you can find out what that one is, and you should use that one line. For the postmodernists, things are more complex. There are many different meta-narratives that explain those phenomena. No one explains everything perfectly, and we can't be confident or sure that we have the right one. For the modernist, there's one interpretation. There's one right way to interpret the world and govern society. For the postmodernist, there's multiple interpretations. There are different ways to interpret the data, leading to different meta-narratives, none of which are objectively correct. For the modernist, conformity is important. There's one right governance strategy or explanation for reality that will work in all situations, and we should apply that to all situations. For the postmodernist, individualism is more important. There's no one perfect right governance system, no right policy interpretation of the data. So, now that we've talked about what political postmodernism is, let's look at some objections. So, as with the instrumentalists' objection to the incommensurability of scientific paradigms from the last video, we're going to raise the concern that individual political meta-narratives can be assessed on criteria other than their accuracy. We may never be able to know exactly which meta-narrative perfectly will predict data, but we might be able to say that, you know what, this meta-narrative has caused a lot of harm, and this meta-narrative has not caused harm. So even if it's wrong, we might go with that other meta-narrative as a way to plan our policies, though not necessarily as a way to find truth. One might claim that meta-narratives could be assessed on whether they successfully predict future trends, or must alter their theories to accommodate data points that they failed to predict. Even if a given meta-narrative can never be shown to be perfectly accurate, we can assess which meta-narratives are better at predicting future data points and which are worse. For example, if a conspiracy theory says that the world will end on a given day and is proven wrong, that may be one reason to not use it as a predictive tool in the future. But, once again, as meta-narratives shift and change, we still should suspend judgment as good skeptics because we don't necessarily know that any given meta-narrative is perfectly correct or right. Since suspending action in political matters is impossible, even if we can suspend belief about their truth, as taking no action is in many ways a type of action in supporting whatever systems exist, even the skeptic of meta-narratives must take action with incomplete information. However, the postmodernist notion that this means we are completely underdetermined as to which meta-narrative we can use to assess a given policy seems oversimplified. We may be underdetermined as to which one is correct or accurate, but there seem to be other characteristics of meta-narratives that we can use to assess them. I can doubt the overall claims of a given meta-narrative, say capitalism, but still take actions based on a particular situation, as it may have the best predictive model based on its track record, for example, predicting how prices will change if a particular event occurs. At best, postmodernism should convince us to suspend our beliefs that one view of the world is and will always be perfectly right. But that doesn't mean that we can't make individual choices about individual policies when faced with those situations, because inevitably we're going to be faced with choices we have to make without complete information. Or compare the quality of a variety of meta-narratives on other grounds like predictability. What do you think? Is socialism, capitalism, liberal democracy, etc. always right and there's one clear meta-narrative and everyone else is just wrong? Or is the reason that we can't agree on a meta-narrative not because people believe in the other meta-narrative are stupid, but because there are multiple meta-narratives that sufficiently explain all of the data points that we see, and we're underdetermined as to which is the correct one. And so maybe we're making those choices based on how we were brought up, the kinds of things that we like, or things like predictability. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org. Hit subscribe, hit the notification bell if you like this video and you want to see more like it so that you stay up to date. We are going to be, after this video, delving into the much more philosophical side of postmodernism, looking at postmodernism about language, truth, and rationality itself. So stay tuned for those videos, and as always, stay skeptical, everybody.